Welcome to Conversations for Our Time podcast number 15 with the Quiet Sun team, George and John. Today we are going to get stuck in talking more about composting types, the ingredients, mineral amendments, biological amendments. If we get time, if not, we'll continue on in the next podcast. We're just going to go even more deeper than we did on the last podcast, and just getting more involved in how to regenerate and bring that life back into our soil to have healthy plants and healthy food. And whilst we're doing this, we are, taking back control of our lives and how we live, taking control of our own health, and trying to find ways to build communities in each town, if we can, slowly moving back to the days where the generations before us really understood how to work with nature and to live naturally. They didn't know what chemicals were. Everything was organic and things were much purer back then. So this will be part 5 of the mini series. How you doing, John?
Yeah, I'm good, George. I'm good. Always growing, man. I find this time of year quite interesting, actually, because in the temperate zones in the northern hemisphere, there's not much you can grow. So I think there's a lot of time for reflection, and obviously we can be building soil now as well. But it's really interesting, if you look at this kind of transition between from the summer to the autumn, there's this kind of transition with everything starting to shut down. And, for physiologically, we feel like we're being starved of sunlight, starved of light, of heat, all these kind of things, which comes from this kind of conditioning we have, whether it's our ego or whatever. But the interesting thing is, this is the time for regeneration, So as we go into autumn, things start dying, things start decomposing. It's a really good time to make compost now, and it's a really good time for reflecting as well. So, like, what happened this year? What did I do? How can I grow? How can I expand? How can I open, to be in preparation for spring? And all animals and all life are doing this in their own unique way. They're preparing for the season. So I think I just wanted to kind of, that just kind of popped into my mind as you were kind of introducing what we're going to be talking about. So obviously these mineral amendments and the biological amendments, this is a time to practice. This is a time to prepare for spring. We have 4 months really, right? We've got November, December, January and February. February you can start thinking about sowing seeds. But it's a really good time to get your compost done, work on your soil for next year, research what good soil is. And I've actually got, we spoke about this yesterday or the other day. I'm going to be starting a 12-month workshop series to do with regenerative living. So it's how can we prepare for the changes that are going to happen on a societal level globally. Things are moving so quick now that people, I think, it's very easy to panic, because there's a lot of stuff we can't control. So much. We can't control the movements of the stars. We can't control the climate. We can't control the elite, but what we can control is how we respond and how we adapt, how we grow, how we expand. So this is why we're doing these podcasts, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it gives us time to, it's up to us how we react to all of this, what's happening into the world, where we have been, we're not gonna hide away with the fact that, we were extremely worried in the first, the last couple of years of what are we going to do, but what we've done is we've dived into just learning and adapting and working with nature, just because the main growing season is finished. There's still a lot to do. It is sure we're going into slightly hibernation mode, but there are still things that we can grow in the autumn and winter, and there's things that we can still read books. We can start thinking about the composting, as you said, and before we know it, it will be February, and we'll be sowing those seeds again. So it's all preparation, and we've done podcasts on it on the past, but it's also good to learn how to preserve food over the autumn and winter months. It's great if people have got their own homestead or their own bit of land and they've got a root cellar and they've stocked up, but we haven't. But there are things that we can still do. You can store food in different ways, and it's very easy. Like we talked about previously, dehydrating. It's not the best, but it's something that's very cheap and something that we can practice. Over the autumn and winter months. So there's lots to do, and there's lots to get into. And you're right, this time of the year is the composting. So we'll go into the composting types, bacterial or fungal. Just go into, John, what are the pros and cons? Because what we're really looking for is the balance. And what we mean by that is also the ratios. For example, the carbon to nitrogen. So just go into that slowly to give people an idea, and what else you've learned that's new since we talked about it last.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So there are various types of composting depending on what you want to achieve. I actually did a workshop on this earlier this month, specifically on composting, really. So we have your normal static compost, your mouldering compost, some people call it. That's the compost you see on the allotment. Doesn't take much work. You just kind of throw anything in there, and to a degree, hope for the best. You might turn it every month, maybe. Yeah. The problem with that is it's inaccurate. So you can't get. There isn't a prescribed method to it. So you can control it to a degree by the inputs. The composting I tend to do, like we did this started this a few years ago, didn't we?
Yeah.
Is thermophilic composting. So the idea of that is you create an environment by volume and by the materials you use that creates a thermophilic process which entices certain bacteria to break down the material in the compost. And so you can make compost, you can break down organic matter incredibly quickly within 21 days. It depends how big the pile is and how many times you turn it. But the issue with this type of composting is because you're doing it under such heat, not the issues, but the challenges are you need to put a lot of effort into it. You need to put a lot of time into it. You need to be pretty healthy to be able to do it. And you have to be measuring things all the time. So you have to be measuring the temperature. You have to be measuring the moisture. So, and you need a bit of space to do it. It's great so thermophilic composting has been around for some time, but there are extensions to this which can control a lot of the things that weren't before possible. So when you use hot composting, you get a lot of nitrogen and carbon gassing off from the materials. So with thermophilic composting, you have 3 different types of compost material. You have your nitrogenous material, which is your greens. You have your browns, which is your carbonaceous material. And then you have your manure, which is the stuff that actually starts to create the heat for you.
Yes.
You can add lots of other things into it, and you can have composting charts which will tell you how much carbon, how much nitrogen is in particular materials. Yeah. So in grass clippings, you're going to have a high nitrogen content. In wood chips, you're going to have a high carbon content. So depending on if you want to make bacterial or fungal compost, that will be determined by what materials you use. So the more carbonaceous, the best way to describe this is, or the best, it's an easy way to think about it, is fungi loves wood. It loves woody material. It breaks down the lignin. So if you use a lot of woody material, which is carbonaceous, you're going to get more of a fungal component to the compost. If you use more grass clippings or even things like hay, so when we first started doing it, we were just using hay, manure, grass. You're always going to get bacterial compost from that. Yeah?
Yeah.
You can change it to a degree by adding things that are fungal foods. So you can go straight into it and go, right, I want fungal compost. The reason I want fungal compost is because I'm going to grow things that require compost that has a lower pH. Fungal compost has a lower pH. Bacterial compost has a higher pH.
Yeah, makes sense.
So say you, and this is what I was teaching in the workshop, it's all contextual. If you want to grow brassicas, yeah, you want more bacterial dominant compost. If you want to grow fruit bushes, you want more fungal dominant compost. If you're going to grow a variety of things, you want what we call facultative compost. And that is bacteria and fungi that can exist in slightly acidic soil and slightly acidic conditions and slightly alkaline conditions. So an orchardist is always going to go for fungal compost unless if an orchardist has got a pH of say 5.6, yeah, he'll want slightly bacterial compost because not many plants grow in pH 5.6. Blueberries do. But if he wants to grow fruit trees and stuff, he'll want slightly bacterial compost to bring the pH up a little bit so it's hovering between, say, 6 and 6.5.
Yeah,
does that make sense? Yeah?
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
What compost you make and whether it's bacterial, facultative, or fungal depends on where your soil's at the moment and what you want to grow. That's really the determining factor. It's all about context. There's no one size fits all. Anyone that tells you that is then, so there's always a balance. And so if you want to make thermophilic compost or hot compost, you're always going to have, up until recently when I started to learn this, there would always be a trade-off. We remember when we did the things and the piles shrunk really quickly?
Yeah.
That's the carbon and the nitrogen gassing out of the material.
Yes.
Yeah. So we were like, damn, that's gone from 1,000 litres to 600 litres, and it was really annoying, wasn't it? Because you were just like, shit.
Yeah.
So what you can do to control that is there are things that you can add to control that gassing off. So there's two things. There's lab, which is lactobacillus. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also EM, which is effective microbes, which has lab in it, but it also has a number of other things. And so what you can do with EM and lab is you turn it less. And I mean, it can get quite in depth, but you can turn it less, and you also ensure, because when you're making compost, the thing that you have to be aware of is the bacteria in thermophilic composting. You have to be selecting the right bacteria. If you don't turn hot compost enough, you invite pathogens into the material.
Yes.
Because pathogens love anaerobic conditions. So anaerobic means when there's no oxygen.
No oxygen, yeah.
But if you turn the pile too much, you oxidize, you lose oxygen. And when you lose oxygen, you lose energy. And when you lose energy, you then lose the ability for that compost to give your plants what they need. So by using EM and lab, you both suppress pathogens, but you also don't have to turn it as much. So it means you don't lose energy from the compost, and you don't gas off as much. So it means that the volume of the compost doesn't decrease as much. So so you can do that, or you can combine static composting with thermophilic composting in a thing called a Johnson-Su bioreactor or something similar, where you build a big compost pile, usually in a cage, on some crates, but you don't turn it at all. And what you do is you stick perforated tubes in the actual compost, and that aerates the compost, right? Because you've then got airflow through it because you've perforated those tubes. Because air can travel through compost or compost material to a certain degree. It's usually about 18 inches. And after that, you can't get any air pass through it. So this Johnson-Su, which was invented by a guy called Dr. Johnson and his wife, I can't remember her first name, but her surname Sue, they created this thing. And that is the most highly dense bacterial and fungal compost that has been created that anyone's aware of.
I was going to say, because it is from the research I've done, it's probably the best compost you can get.
Yeah, and from their research and testing, after they've applied it, that compost is still having an effect on the land that I applied it to for 7 years.
Wow.
It's got that much
truly
diversity.
remarkable.
It is truly remarkable. And you can do it with all sorts of materials. The thing is with that is you need a lot of
space.
You need a lot of space. Well, you can do smaller ones. And Elaine Ingham, who kind of brought hot composting into the forefront, she's now adapting her hot compost piles like the Johnson-Su compost. Right. Where she's sticking perforated tubes in there. She's still getting it done very quickly, but you don't have to turn it. So you're not losing volume. You're not inviting pathogens in, and you don't have to turn it. So and this is a great thing, this is still such a new area, this regenerative growing or regenerative practices, is that there's so many different things that can be achieved just by being creative. And sometimes what you've got, if you haven't got many materials, sometimes you can create. There was a guy called Steve Reisner, who's a cannabis farmer in the US, and he basically made a mistake where he spilled spirulina into his lab, and it turned it into like this super lab. Yeah, so that was just a mistake.
Right.
It was just an accident.
Yeah.
But he somehow just, because cannabis can really suffer from certain pathogens, if it becomes too humid and things like that. So he was making this lab to help with that. So
Yeah,
there's all these. This is the thing, like nature's biodiverse, so the way we make compost can also be biodiverse. Not one person is going to have a monopoly on the market. I've learned these things in the past, like say 6 months, and I'm sure in the next 6 months I'll learn completely new things where it's just like, wow, God, we can make even better compost now. So,
exactly. Like I said before, it's like when we when we really start. I mean, when you go to the allotments, they don't. It's sad to say that they don't really care much about the soil. They will, you know, do the static composting, and they will even chuck down unrotted manure, which is one of the worst things you could do to the soil. But when we go into when you actually research, the composting and the soil and everything that you're doing, there's a whole different universe to be found, and it's
mm,
such a massive chunk of knowledge that is missing from everyday people. But we are really trying to bring it about. Then the main thing is, what we did when we were making this thermophilic composting. It was the experience
mm,
to see for it ourselves, and then what the pioneers are doing. They're experimenting, they're adjusting, they're changing things, and they're improving it. And this is what we want to encourage people to do. If you have the time and space to do it, the only way you're going to learn is to actually do it yourself. And it's absolutely brilliant to watch these people and read books, but it's the experience of it. And because you've just given us a whole bunch of new information compared to the last time that we discussed it. So what I
mm.
recommend the audience to do is to go back to listen to our other podcasts where they can get the basic procedure, which we don't need to go into right now, of how to actually do the thermophilic compost and how we were actually doing it, and then listen to this podcast again to get the new bits and new ways that you're doing it, because you're forever researching this stuff, and there is a never ending as I say, it's like an in-depth thing that there's no end to it. You're always going to find something new,
That's it.
and it's about adapting to it.
Yeah, and you know, it's like we need to adapt and change in order to progress. And um, it's really about kind of the thing I'm learning about working with soil or compost or plants is it's constantly challenging my ego, about what I think is best. And so we've got to be really open. This is why I talked about being open at the beginning. Is like this is a time, especially now, where we can slow down a bit, where we can be open to new ideas and new concepts and learning from different people.
Yeah,
I'm part of this other group where I get my compost and soil tested, which is in Hampshire. Um, they have this, there's loads of people on there making compost, and there's a leaderboard, you know, and some people are making like the most amazing compost, and I, I'm really inspired by that. Like everyone's kind of trying to follow their path. You've got to do what's true to you to be
yeah,
authentic, you know, and so yeah. Whereas, my path is to try things out, to learn an incredible amount of information and knowledge, and then to teach other people. That's really what I feel my path is. You know, that might change in years to come. So there's so much to experience and learn. There's so many, it's like the effective microbes. These were created like decades ago, right, by a guy called Dr. Higa. But there are so many combinations of effective microbes that all sorts of people can create, because you can make them yourself from nature. And this is the greatest thing, is if we learn about nature, we can create amendments, biological amendments. We can play around with minerals. When we understand the mineral cycles, we know what plants need at what times. We can start making out, and where these minerals come from, we can start making our own mineral amendments. And this is when it starts to get interesting, because then we become alchemists. So forget chemistry and biology you learned in school. This is real applied alchemy. And
it is 100%.
You're healing the earth and you're healing yourself at the same time.
It is truly remarkable when you learn this information. There's so much knowledge to obtain out there, and we do become alchemists. This is the time now to do all this, to do all this and gather the information, learn off each other and spread the information, because a lot of what you're talking about, there is barely anybody in the truth and freedom movement talking about this. And this is what I want to do. I want to gather these podcasts and share it amongst them, because there's nothing more. I can't think of any other way to connect with nature more than working with the soil and learning how to go back to the ways that we had everything that we needed in our fruit and vegetables. This is what we have to do. We have to bring those times back. And we didn't have very much. You and I didn't have very much, but we still went out there and managed to make our own compost in different ways. And
we got nearly everything for free, man.
Yeah.
And this is the other thing, George. When it comes to human health, it's directly related to the soil, right? But that's directly related to the sun. So we have this cycle, right? And it's from a cosmic level down to a microcosmic level. So whatever we feed the soil, we feed ourselves. And it's the same as whatever thoughts and feelings we have and emotions and how we make people feel, it's coming back to us. And this is one thing that I'm starting to specialize now. Of all the things I've studied, whether it's psychology or the soil or the cosmos or spirituality, they all have cycles, and those cycles are everywhere. And when we start to understand these, I'm not a scientist. I got one GCSE, C and above, and that was sociology. But when you realize how important these things are and how fundamental they are to life in general, you can do anything you want. You can learn anything you want. Literally, you can do it, So I'm saying this to encourage people that if they think, oh, that's going to be too hard, or I can't do that, or I was crap at school, so that's not going to work for me. Don't listen to your programming. Don't listen to your conditioning, because this is about evolution of your soul. It's not about who's better at what.
I think that's 100% true, because we need to go at our own pace and not be, as I said before in our previous podcast, that this isn't to overwhelm anybody. What we do is we take little bits of information and process it at our own pace. There's always going to be somebody that's ahead of us. There's always going to be some people that's behind us or on our level. It's just do it step by step. And this is how we've done it. We're trying to do all these things step by step, even if we've got time. Even vermicomposting, which is something that probably everyone can do if they have a little bit of space. So if you can quickly go into, if we have time, vermicomposting and composting in windrows on a large scale, bokashi, and you may have touched upon hugelkulturs
Yeah,
in the
I'll tell you
previous
what.
book.
If I just cover vermicomposting, because I reckon we got about 5 minutes. So
Yeah, yeah. If
um,
you can just explain like anything updated, because we've talked about it before in previous podcasts, and
yeah,
anything else that
sure,
you've learned to update,
sure.
that'd be a nice way to end
So
podcast on.
okay, so the one thing that I've learned most recently about vermicomposting is make it simple. Make it as
Yeah,
simple as don't bother building. Look, we built these layered like compost things, right? And there's loads of things on the market where they're all layered and the worms go through the holes and you feed them from above and they come from below.
yeah,
But probably the most successful vermicomposting setups are because they're simple. And the thing is, it's about replicating nature as quickly as closely as we can. So there's no point building these systems because that's not how composting worms actually feed in the wild. Composting worms are surface dwellers. They only exist within the first couple of centimeters, and they feed on leaf litter in the natural setting. They feed on leaf litter and decomposing matter. Yeah. So if you're
yeah.
building a layered system, yeah, kind of, it's not to say this is necessarily wrong, but if you want simple and easy, just build a wooden box, preferably non-treated because you don't want toxins going into the worms.
Yes, of course.
Make it simple. And the other thing about citrus, you can use citrus, but just don't go overboard. Remember, these guys produce bacterially dominated compost. So if you feed them too much acidic stuff, it's not going to be good for them. They're like, if we have too much acidic stuff, we get ulcers. It's a similar
Exactly.
thing. Now, the greatest thing about vermicomposting, linking it to EM, is this: that vermicompost or worms, compost worms. The other thing is, just as a side note, if you're going to do vermicomposting, please only get red wrigglers, because if you get
Red
anything
Wigglers,
else,
yeah.
they can be invasive to our biome. We don't want that. That happened in America. They had European night crawlers and they took them over to America and they messed up all their woodlands. Yeah, so we've got to be really careful about that. That's really
Yeah,
important to remember. So red
very good
regulars,
point.
yep. So the greatest thing about red regulars or any compost worms is they produce PNSB in their gut, which is purple non-sulfur bacteria. Purple non-sulfur bacteria is one of the components of EM. Okay. And the really good thing about purple non-sulfur bacteria is it's a nitrogen fixer, it's a phosphorus solubilizer, it accumulates heavy metals. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's loads of other things that they haven't discovered yet. So you can use PNSB as a component of EM. So if you have PNSB, you have lab and you have molasses. So lab you can culture. We can go on to this in the next podcast.
Yes, of course, yeah.
You can make your own lab. You can make your own EMs. You don't even need to buy it. And this is the beauty of nature, is literally everything is working in this beautiful symphony. Why do compost worms produce PNSB in their gut? It's because they're designed to be a cycler in the soil.
Right.
So they are
Okay.
not, they're not just decomposing stuff, they're also from their waste, they're creating an environment for more nitrogen. They mobilize phosphorus. Yeah, because phosphorus isn't completely mobile, so it's not completely soluble. So they can then allow phosphorus to be uptaken by plants. This is a beautiful symphony.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the latest thing I've heard in vermicompost. And I think like probably we can leave it here and tackle the rest in the next podcast, George.
Oh yes, no, I think that's a great way to end the podcast. I think you're bringing in so much. It's so valuable what you're bringing in. I think people are going to really relate to this, because this is all stuff that people generally haven't heard of. And I'm excited for this, our mini series, basically just bringing in so much knowledge into it. And we'll continue this next week. Is there anything else you want to add on before we end the podcast, John?
I just want to say that I've been following a couple of people, observing a couple of people recently. There's a really good podcast called Wake the Fake Up.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Myself and my girlfriend, Monica, obviously know Monica, we've been watching them, and there's been some amazing people on there. And recently we watched this woman called Blue, and she's originally from an aristocratic family, but she's kind of gone down this route of self-discovery, self-love. And she was just talking about authenticity, and I think it's really important that we're authentic, so I just want to kind of leave that with people, is like, what is your authenticity? Because you're the person who is able to know that. Nobody else can tell you. Do you want to live the life of someone else, or what you expect other people think you are? Do you want to be living your life through their eyes, or do you want to be living your life through your own unique creation? Because whether on which of those you choose, you're still going to be judged. This is what she was saying. So actually, it's better to be authentic to yourself. And I think that's what I want to leave people with.
Absolutely. I think that's the great way to end the podcast. And it is about authenticity. Keep learning new things, and keep self-healing. And it's all about self-love and connecting back to nature. So thanks everyone for listening. Tune in for the next one, and take care. Thanks, John.
Thanks, George.
Pond 5.